The queen, my mother, smiled as she offered a cube of sugar in her upturned palm. Greedily, I accepted. I reached inside my mouth delicately, placing one, just one, on the center of my tongue, and I clamped down. Salt. This is what abuse is. Knowing you are going to get salt, but still hoping for sugar for 19 years. You may be gone, but I still have a stomachache. So, this is a poem from Amanda Lovelace's 2016 collection, The Princess Saves Herself in this one, and it's a poem I've wanted to talk about for a long time. See, if you followed me for a while, you probably already know that I don't really like Amanda Lovelace's poetry, and yet there's something about this poem in particular. Don't get me wrong, there are features here that I really don't like, and we will get to those soon enough. But still, why is this poem so different from Lovelace's other work? Well, to answer that, let's first talk about good, bad, and the purpose of poetry. Then we'll take a look at a couple of Lovelace's other poems. When it comes to measuring good and bad in art, a lot of subjectivity is involved, and there's no denying that, especially when taking into account culture and time period. A poem we might deem great in the modern day could have been seen as terrible 100 years ago, and vice versa. What's more, every literary critic has their biases, and you will likely see mine come through in this video. So what makes good poetry? I've said it before, but there are really two main factors, in my opinion. The first is empathy. How well does a poem communicate the human experience? Again, there's a lot of subjectivity there, but cultural consensus can be our friend in such matters. The other main factor for me is saying something in a way nobody has ever said it before. That's kind of the big divide between poetry and prose for me. The ability to say things you wouldn't otherwise be able to except in a poem. And obviously there's more to it than all this, and there are many nuances, of course. You can watch my old Rupi Kaur video if you want to hear more about all of it, but with those things in mind, let's get back to Lovelace. Here's a poem Lovelace posted on her Instagram in January 2020. I don't know who needs to hear this, but it's okay if someone doesn't like you. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. Some kinds of magic just don't call to each other. This poem is trying to get at something very human, so there is sort of an element of empathy. The only problem is, Lovelace isn't saying what she means in a very new or creative way. You've likely heard this sentiment expressed before. As such, it probably doesn't hit very hard. There's almost something there with that last stanza, but it leaves the reader wanting so much more. This is what the poem truly should have been about, the different kinds of magic that people wield and how those kinds of magic don't call to each other. I would have appreciated more showing and less telling there. That could have been a really creative poem. Here's another example. He was made of fire and I was made of ice. I came too close to his flame and he melted me with his embers, reducing me down to a puddle. With time I froze over again, but I was never quite the same. A fragile, watery imitation of what once was. Where was my fear of fire when it came to you? You'll notice all the red strike-throughs in this image. That was author Janice Greenwood trying to distill the poem down to its essence, and I mostly have to agree with her. A lot of the language here just isn't carrying the weight of the lines. A lot of the words feel superfluous. They don't really add anything to the overall sentiment. But there's a bigger problem here, in my opinion. Greenwood says this poem is a parody of Robert Frost's Fire and Ice, but frankly, I'm just not sure that's the case. I think Lovelace was just taking fire and ice as symbols into her own hands. But that's the problem. There is already so much literature that uses fire and ice as symbols, so what is it that differentiates the symbols in this poem? Well, unfortunately, not much. Like I said, it's all about saying things in new and creative ways. There's nothing wrong with using fire and ice in a poem, but how will that poem mark itself against all the others that may be similar? So with all that in mind, let's go back to Lovelace's poem, You May Be Gone, But I Still Have a Stomachache. Like I said, there are problems here, and we will get to those, but this poem creates a pretty unique metaphor for a layered and complicated subject. If poetry is about empathy, then a good poem about parental abuse will help me understand a bit better what it's like to be in that situation, and I think this poem does that effectively. What's more, the metaphor is both creative and elicits a reaction from me. Like, can you imagine being offered a sugar cube and popping it in your mouth only to find that it's pure salt? Like, my mouth has a physical reaction just thinking about it, and I can say that I don't think I've ever read a metaphor like that before. But by that token, the poem's biggest weakness should be self-evident, that it feels the need to explain itself to the reader. This line here, this is what abuse is, if I were the editor, I would have told Lovelace to cut that line completely. I think a reader can put that together for themselves. The poem doesn't need to hold the audience's hand. There are other things that bother me here, like when the speaker emphasizes one, just one. There's no need for that emphasis. The mother only offered the speaker one cube in the first place. How could they even place more than one? It's that superfluousness again. If the mother had given a handful of cubes, then sure, but as is, it's kind of confusing. There's also the fact that the queen is crossed out. Shouldn't it be my mother that's crossed out? Like, isn't the idea here that the speaker is trying to distance themselves from this by turning it into a fairy tale type story? I don't know, man. I just work here. Regardless, despite all of the things that detract from it, it's the best I've seen from Lovelace, and I can't deny its strengths. If you like Lovelace, more power to you. I'm not trying to say you're wrong for that. Everyone has their own taste, and that's fine. Still, I would encourage you to read other poets too. Lovelace is great to start with. Now, try diversifying a little bit. And that goes for all of the poets I'm going to talk about here. If you like them, great. And me calling them bad might even be controversial to some of you. Just know, you can disagree with me, that's totally fine. I just hope all of my viewers here might try broadening their horizons. But with that, let's turn back the clock. Knight of the White Elephant of Burma, William McGonagall, despite having a pretty awesome title, is widely considered to be the worst poet of all time, and if you've read his stuff, well, it's not hard to see why. McGonagall's poems are a total slog. Overly long with uninspired rhymes, way too much repeated information, and a fundamental unwillingness to understand meter. And I'll acknowledge, I'm also bad when it comes to rhythm and meter, but McGonagall's stuff really takes the cake. Like, let me just read you a third of this poem, The Famous Tay Whale. 'Twas in the month of December, and in the year 1883, that a monster whale came to Dundee, resolved for a few days to sport and play, and devour the small fishes in the silvery Tay. So the monster whale did sport and play among the innocent little fishes in the beautiful Tay, until he was seen by some men one day, and they resolved to catch him without delay. When it came to be known a whale was seen in the Tay, some men began to talk and to say, "We must try and catch this monster of a whale, so come on, brave boys, and never say fail." Then the people together in crowds did run, resolved to capture the whale and to have some fun. So small boats were launched on the silvery Tay, while the monster of the deep did sport and play. Oh, it was a most fearful and beautiful sight, to see it lashing the water with its tail all its might, and making the water ascend like a shower of hail, with one lash of its ugly and mighty tail. Then the water did descend on the men in the boats, which wet their trousers and also their coats. But it only made them the more determined to catch the whale, but the whale shook at them his tail. I hope you could feel the same tedium that I did while reading it. Given their construction, McGonagall's poems have a strange sort of humor to them. With a lot of his poems, you get the impression that there will be some ironic twist at the end, that the poor form is all leading up to some joke. But no, the poems are all played entirely straight, and that, in a hilarious sort of way, just makes them really funny. I struggle to find something else to compare it to other than a Neil Breen film. But amid McGonagall's strange pile of duds, there is one that stands out as at least passable. And some important context here, a shillelagh is a walking stick. The Rattling Boy from Dublin. I'm a rattling boy from Dublin town. I courted a girl called Biddy Brown. Her eyes, they were as black as sloes. She had black hair and an aquiline nose. Wackfaldida fall de derelidu, wackfaldida fall de derelay, wackfaldida fall de derelidu, wackfaldida fall de derelay. One night I met her with another lad. Says I, Biddy, I've caught you by dad. I never thought you were half so bad as to be going about with another lad. Says I, Biddy, this will never do, for tonight you've proved to me untrue. So do not make a hullabaloo, for I will bid farewell to you. Says Barney McGee, she is my lass, and the man that says no, he is an ass. So come away and I'll give you a glass. Och, sure, you can get another lass. Says I, to the devil with your glass, you have taken from me my darling lass, and if you look angry or offer to frown, with my darling shillelagh I'll knock ye down. Says Barney McGee unto me, by the hokey, I love Biddy Brown, and before I'll give her up to thee, one or both of us will go down. So with my darling shillelagh I gave him a whack, which left him lying on his back, saying, botheration to you and Biddy Brown, for I'm the rattling boy from Dublin town. So a policeman chanced to come up at the time, and he asked of me the cause of the shine. Says I, he threatened to knock me down, when I challenged him for walking with my Biddy Brown. So the policeman took Barney McGee to jail, which made him shout and bewail that ever he met with Biddy Brown, the greatest deceiver in Dublin town. So I bade farewell to Biddy Brown, the greatest jilter in Dublin town, because she proved untrue to me, and was going about with Barney McGee. Like the Lovelace poem, this piece is not without its faults, but it is much stronger than McGonagall's other pieces. For one thing, it does kind of have more of the overt humor that a reader would expect from his work. Like, let's break down this situation for a second. The speaker is mad that Biddy Brown is cheating on him, and he tells Barney McGee that he can have her. But then Barney says that Biddy is his girl, so the speaker fights him, even though he doesn't want Biddy anymore. Like, come on, this is kind of funny, especially in its accurate portrayal of male competition. It's also kind of nice how the speaker, despite fighting Barney, still doesn't take Biddy back. He's not fighting Barney for her, but for himself. You might also notice that the rhythm, while not perfect, is mostly pretty consistent throughout, more so than McGonagall's other poems. That's actually because this poem wasn't written as a poem, but instead as a song. The Wakfaldida section is the song's chorus, and it's meant to be repeated after every stanza, but I spared you all from that. Even though it's separated from its original tune in the modern day, the text still stands as perhaps McGonagall's strongest poem. It's kind of funny to think about. If McGonagall had just leaned into what made his work so silly and hadn't taken himself so seriously, he might have had more hits. But hey, at least he's remembered for something. Now, you probably knew we couldn't get through this video without bringing up Rupi Kaur. I've said it before, but I honestly feel Kaur has the capacity to be a great poet. Granted, I believe that about everybody, but in Kaur's case, she's actually shown that capability from time to time. The poem I've chosen for this video was brought to my attention by Lexi, aka Newly Nova, and if you haven't seen her video on Kaur, you should definitely check it out. It's super insightful. But anyhow, here's the poem. Father, you always call to say nothing in particular. You ask what I'm doing or where I am, and when the silence stretches like a lifetime between us, I scramble to find questions to keep the conversation going. What I long to say most is, I understand this world broke you. It has been so hard on your feet. I don't blame you for not knowing how to remain soft with me. Sometimes I stay up thinking of all the places you are hurting, which you'll never care to mention. I come from the same aching blood, from the same bone, so desperate for attention. I collapse in on myself. I am your daughter. I know the small talk is the only way you know how to tell me you love me, because it is the only way I know how to tell you. It's still not a perfect poem by any means, but there's a lot to like here. One of Kaur's greatest weaknesses as a poet is that she too often tells the audience just how it is. Like in the Lovelace poem, where she held the reader's hand with the whole "this is what abuse is" line. Kaur doesn't often leave much work for the reader to do, let alone paint a picture for them, and that tends to make her poetry pretty boring. But here we have a physical scene between two people, which already makes the poem more engaging than a lot of her strict ruminations, or rupinations, if you will. What's more, there are actually some pretty engaging lines here. My favorite is, "It has been so hard on your feet." There's a nice double meaning there, the first being that the world has literally been rough against the father's feet, the second being that the father has had a hard time trying to stay on his feet, or rather, the father has had to stay on his feet and that has been difficult for him. I also like the lines, "I come from the same aching blood, from the same bone, so desperate for attention, I collapse in on myself." The blood and bone mentions there are obvious familial references, the two literally descended from the same line, but also emphasize how the speaker and the father both hurt on their insides and prefer to keep that pain inside of them. There's even more to enjoy here than that. I kind of prefer that Kaur took a prose poem approach to this one. That is, she didn't use any line breaks and just formatted it like prose. Kaur's line breaks often feel really obvious or completely arbitrary, so I'm glad they're not here to distract from what's working in this poem. Like I said, it's not perfect, but the poem still has some clear humanity. It makes me feel at least something, which is more than I can say for a lot of Kaur's stuff. And hey, while we're on the subject of Kaur and Lovelace, let's move into Charles Bukowski. Like I said earlier, it might be controversial to call Bukowski a bad poet, but a lot of his worst tendencies really stand out when you read a full collection. Still, some folks would hesitate to call Bukowski bad because of his influence on poetry as we know it today. He might honestly be the most influential poet of our modern times. But was that influence really all that positive? Remember how I said Kaur's line breaks often feel arbitrary or otherwise obvious? The same is true for Bukowski. Like, look at any of his poems and you can clearly see the way he inspired Insta poetry. A lot of short, arguably unsubstantive lines, and a structure that doesn't always feel very meaty. I made a community post about him not long ago, and as one commenter pointed out, his stuff probably felt avant-garde back in the day, but now it just feels kind of meh. I've been working my way through this collection, Love is a Dog from Hell, and there are some real stinkers in here. But for the most part, I'd say the poems just kind of teeter on being almost great. I think Bukowski has two main strengths. His first is his ability to craft a simile, but more than that, he is at his best, I think, when he takes mundane, everyday scenes and implicitly gives them greater significance by writing about them. There often isn't lengthy reflection, there's just the scene, that is, the showing instead of telling, and maybe a brief insight. And that's sort of what separates him from a lot of the people who were inspired by him. A lot of insta-poets today just do far too much telling and not enough showing. But so many of his poems feel so similar that they all start to kind of bleed together. I won't bury the lead here. Bukowski wrote about sex and women so much that it's actually his poems where sex isn't mentioned at all that really shine. I want to highlight this one in particular. This poet. This poet, he'd been drinking 2 or 3 days, and he walked out on the stage and looked at the audience, and he just knew he was going to do it. There was a grand piano on stage, and he walked over and lifted the lid and vomited inside the piano. Then he closed the lid and gave his reading. They had to remove the strings from the piano and wash out the insides and restring it. I can understand why they never invited him back, but to pass the word on to other universities that he was a poet who liked to vomit into grand pianos was unfair. They never considered the quality of his reading. I know this poet. He's just like the rest of us. He'll vomit anywhere for money. Here, the line breaks certainly don't feel arbitrary. Maybe they feel obvious in the sense that you can very clearly see the shape of the poem, but I'd argue the line breaks are very unintuitive here, in a good way. Rather than filling the lines with words that would fit perfectly, the words spill over, conforming to shape rather than convention. These breaks leave me asking what Bukowski is up to with this chosen structure, and honestly, I still don't know for sure. On the one hand, the stanzas kind of look like piano keys, but I don't think that's all there is to it. It's significant to me that he chose this structure for a poem that is about a poet. It is inherently self-referential, even more so than the average poem, so in that sense, it's not all that surprising that the author wanted to draw attention to the work itself in this way. Still, I'm not entirely sure what the motivation is here, but in a way, I don't mind being left with that question. It certainly gives me something to think about after turning the page, which is another reason this particular poem stuck with me. What's more, the image of the poet throwing up into the piano? Whether that's real or imagined, it's so interesting and creative that it totally justifies itself as the subject of a poem. A lot of times people levy criticism against certain poems asking, what makes this a poem? Why isn't it just a piece of prose or an inspirational quote or something on a greeting card? And while the subject could certainly have been treated in prose, I think approaching it in a poem just makes sense. But maybe that take is too subjective. One thing I'm not sure I love about the poem is how Bukowski kind of starts to moralize or reflect at the end. Much like Lovelace and Cour, it kind of feels like I'm being told what to think. But at the same time, I can't say I totally disagree with the conclusion, so it's fine. Even so, part of me can't help but wonder how the poem would read if it had ended after they never considered the quality of his reading. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, viewer. That'll take us into our last author for this video, a pick that might be just as, if not more controversial than Bukowski, Wendy Cope. I don't think Cope is strictly a bad poet. In fact, I maybe even like her work better than Bukowski's. I don't know, it's hard to say. The one thing both authors had in common for me is that their work can be pretty hit or miss, but I think I've grown to appreciate both of them more and more over time. What I especially appreciate about Cope is her sense of humor, not to mention her efforts in rhyme and meter. Here are a couple of good examples. Loss. The day he moved out was terrible. That evening she went through hell. His absence wasn't a problem, but the corkscrew had gone as well. Favorite. When they ask me, who's your favorite poet, I'd better not mention you. Though you certainly are my favorite poet, and I like your poems too. Kind of cute, kind of silly, also kind of dumb. They leave me wanting more in some respects, but I can appreciate what's there. They're not great, but they at least give me a quick smile, which is more than I can say for many, many poems. The same is true especially for this piece. The orange. At lunchtime, I bought a huge orange. The size of it made us all laugh. I peeled it and shared it with Robert and Dave. They got quarters and I had a half. And that orange, it made me so happy, as ordinary things often do. Just lately, the shopping, a walk in the park. This is peace and contentment. It's new. The rest of the day was quite easy. I did all the jobs on my list. and enjoyed them and had some time over. I love you. I'm glad I exist. There are certainly things I dislike about this poem. As with pretty much all of the poems we've looked at so far, I think it does too much hand-holding and maybe too much telling versus showing. And yet, I just can't bring myself to dislike this poem. It's just bursting with joy. And that sentiment, I love you, I'm glad I exist. That's just so rare these days, the poignancy is kind of beautiful. I think there are some obvious takeaways from this video. For one thing, there's nothing wrong with simple, accessible poetry. All of these poems had their faults, and some of them would have been easy to fix. Even so, they're all still valuable. And don't get me wrong, it's so possible to have an accessible poem without more glaring issues. But even with that being the case, I can't deny that each of these poems is important for one reason or another. Maybe you enjoyed none of these, and that's okay. I was trying to be a little extra kind in this video, but hey, I would love to hear from all of you. Can you think of any good poems from bad poets, or any bad poems from good poets? Please tell me everything. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And hey, if you made it this far, consider supporting me on Patreon. As always, I truly can't thank my patrons enough for their support. If you want to support in other important ways, liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, and watching other videos helps a lot. But you probably already knew that. You can also follow me on my socials if you want. Otherwise, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And one more bit of Wendy Cope for sticking around this long. She is witty and unpretentious, which is both her strength and her limitation. I'm going to try and overcome my limitation. Away with sloth. Now, should I work on being less witty, or more pretentious, or both? They, Roger McGough and Brian Patton, have something in common with her in that they all write to amuse. Write to amuse? What an appalling suggestion. I write to make people anxious and miserable and to worsen their indigestion.